You're all very welcome to the afternoon session. We have ourselves sorted out now. Colin Roppel has kindly agreed to chair this session, and I'm sure you all know Colin by reputation, at least if you don't know him personally. So I'll hand you over right away to Colin.
Quite sure how to take that. I have in my life given pre-retirement talks to the guards, and I've been introduced as, here's a man who's well known to you all. I'm not quite sure how to take that. A few months ago, my son came home from the States and he brought me home this mug, and it had a picture of Karl Marx on it and a balloon out of his mouth saying, "Told you so." And hopes were high that in some quarters, the end of capitalism was nigh. And it'd be nice to think, at least, that the financial crisis had presaged some fundamental change. Unfortunately, I think there's every chance that in a year or two or three, we're going to be back to neoliberal normality. The push to that normality is very evident, I think, not least at the G20 summit last month. We are keeping an eye on the G20 summit here. So this final session is to consider the international financial crisis. What can governments do? I suspect that our speakers will comment not only on what governments can do, but also maybe suggest what the rest of us can do to encourage governments, but our own in particular, to do the right thing. But then the question is, what is the right thing? There are those who apply the logic of capitalism and those who wouldn't. The right thing could be to bring the whole edifice toppling down in the hope that something better can be built from the rubble. And emotionally, I think we might all tend to that view. At the other end of the spectrum, it might be sort of more than just simply ensuring that whatever new system emerges will be better regulated than what's gone before, better regulated in the interests of society as a whole. And within that sort of those two, well, they're not really extremes, but there's a wide spectrum of solutions. Now, we have three excellent speakers, and I must commend the organisers for giving us the opportunity to hear them. We have Kieran Allen, who's a senior lecturer in the School of Sociology in UCD, and his recent publications include Ireland's Economic Crash, A Radical Agenda for Change, and The Corporate Takeover of Ireland. I think both of those, certainly the first one is available outside in the book room outside. He's also written some years ago a major critique on the role that social partnership is claimed to have played in promoting the Celtic Tiger, another work well worth reading. John Foster, an economist, is Emeritus Professor of the University of the West of Scotland, and one of his recent works, the Politics of Britain's Economic Crisis, again, it's available outside. He's a member of the Economic Committee of the Communist Party of Britain, and he recently stood as a no to EU, yes to democracy candidate in the European elections. It's a 4-point platform, I was looking this up, in opposition to Lisbon, very good. Restriction of the movement of labour within the EU, which came as something as a surprise to me. You don't think about it, and maybe we'll have another forum, or maybe we can discuss it maybe later on. An abstentionist policy, refusal to take seats in the European Parliament, and defence of public services from privatisation. Our last speaker, very hard to categorise our final speaker, Ray Kinsella, and he's certainly further to the right, I think, than either of our first two speakers. I think he would agree with that. But it was very wrong to simply describe him as right-wing. He's director of the Centre for Insurance Studies in UCD. He was an economist at the Central Bank and was an economic advisor in the Department of Industry and Commerce. He's a complex individual, I haven't read his recently published book, Rebuilding Trust in Banking, Regulation, Corporate Governance and Ethics in Banking. I think that's just out. It is available, is it right? I haven't seen it, but it's look forward to reading that. But I refreshed my mind on some of his writings and comments with a Google search, and as I said, the views are complex, as befits an academic, and I'm not going to try to summarise them. Suffice it to say that I asked him, was he still opposed to Lisbon, just a few moments ago, and we were waiting. he is and he isn't, but he is, but he would like 10 minutes or a half an hour to explain why, because and again, understandable, and I hope actually we won't spend too much time. I know Lisbon is very much, but it's not really the topic for debate here. Many of his comments that I did see, and I'm probably spending too long, were couched in ethical and moralistic terms. For instance, he was recently quoted as saying that the current crisis represents nothing less than a catastrophic ethical failure, not alone in the financial sphere, but within the broader domain of corporate capitalism. The common good was allowed to be crowded out by the pursuit of short-term monetary and political gain. And he recently wrote, individuals no less than corporations or countries cannot be regulated to do the right or moral thing. We are talking about sin here. A type of behaviour or mindset may not be a crime, it may not be prohibited by rules or regulations, but instinctively we recognise it for what it is, an offence against the moral order. So I think we have a very good mix of speakers here, and I'm sure it's going to be a very good session, and I certainly look forward to hearing it. I think what we'll do is let the three speakers speak in turn, and then hopefully we'll have plenty of time at the end for comment and discussion from the floor and response from the speakers. So first of all, I'll give you Kieran Allen.
Okay, thanks very much to the organisers for inviting me, and thank you very much for coming on this brilliant sunny day. I think it's a testimony to the level of serious debate that's happening in our country, that people do turn up in great numbers for these type of discussions. I think that the topic of global finance is particularly pertinent to this country. We are probably, if the government gets away with it, about to be victims of the greatest bank robbery ever perpetrated on a people. That has started, if we look at the role, just take Ireland for a minute, this country has been, if you like, reshaped over the last 7-8 years by a nexus of Fianna Fáil, the construction industry and the bankers. And it seems to me the easiest way to explain this is to think of a banker as a drug dealer. It's very charitable to bankers, I think, very hard on drug dealers. But a banker starts off as a small dealer, getting their local supplies, trying to addict the local population to borrowing. But at some point they have to move into the bigger game, and the Irish banking industry did that after 1999. Their borrowings from the international money markets in 1999 was 30 billion. Within the space of 9 years, they had pushed that up to 150 billion. They were borrowing more than any banker in the world in order to addict the Irish population to credit. Personal credit in Ireland has shot up dramatically in those years. So, and this of course was aided by the state. It wasn't just the governor of the central bank. We have an Orwellian sense of humour in Ireland. So in 2004 there was a white paper produced called Better Regulation, in which it was argued, quote, "We will regulate as lightly as possible, and we will use innovative measures such as co-regulation." That means we'll regulate the banks and the banks will regulate us. But not just in terms of the banking industry. Before I started doing some research on this book, I actually was not aware of the full extent of Ireland's role in the international speculation industry. To put it in very simple terms, 13% of the Irish workforce are employed in manufacturing, 14% of the Irish workforce are employed in financial services. This country is one of the main locations for hedge fund speculation. Let me just give you the figures. The total value of hedge funds domiciled in Ireland before the crash was 1.24 trillion. Okay, we'll come to what these figures mean in a million, but it's a lot of money. 1.24 trillion was domiciled in hedge funds here. To put that maybe in a context, you'll find that odious man, William Slattery, turning up on the board of Board Snip. He is the CEO of State Street International, which is the main hedge fund administering company in Ireland. Why do hedge funds come to Ireland? Because we have a peculiar tax scam arrangement whereby they can be located in Ireland but claim all the tax benefits of being based in the Cayman Islands or the Barbados, because we're very good at tax scams. So therefore, the first point I want to make is Ireland is a major centre of the hedge fund industry. It's also a major centre for the reinsurance industry. And as these industry grew in the neoliberal era of capitalism, we did well, and as they crashed, Ireland is facing all the consequences of this. Now, the topic therefore is, what can governments do about this? And here I think we have a new vogue, we'll use a term from the French Prime Minister Sarkozy, who thinks that it is possible to return, after this crash, to a regular and regulated capitalism. That's not a phrase from any left-winger, that's from Nicolas Sarkozy. That we can return from a regular and regulated capitalism. And really the parameters of the debate are being set by this. And the options, you can pick and choose your options. The Fianna Fáil government and the Greens think that NAMA will clean out our banks, and then we'll then do some purgatory, and then we'll start introducing regulations. The Fine Gael have a rather complicated proposal, not as good as it sounds, I have to hasten to add, but basically a state bank that's a very small state bank, dependent on private banks, but guaranteeing the international bankers that international bondholders that any loans picked up by the Irish banks will be paid for. And the Labour Party proposal is for nationalisation, but temporary, of course, to take on the debts of the banks, and then we'll hand it back to the private capitalists. But the parameter basically is, at some point, we're going to come out of this and go into a regular and regulated form of capitalism, not just in Ireland, but across the world. Now, I'm going to really argue that is not possible, and we have to look at different solutions. Let me just say a word on figures, because figures do tend to bamboozle people. So I've drawn up here, I was going to show this in PowerPoint, what I call the Human Suffering Index, so that you can understand the figures a little bit easier. When I say the word 700 billion, think of the fact that if that had been used, that would have removed a hunger for 850 million people. So 700 billion means food for the current level of starvation of 850 million. If I say 1 trillion, I mentioned that last and when I talked about the hedge funds, that, just think of that, that would be 2 million people of the world's 6 billion people lifted out of chronic poverty. So it's important to always relate these figures to real human beings and real suffering, because they're getting a little bit surreal at the moment. Now, let's just do a little broad brushstroke of what the problem is in terms of global finance and global speculation. A share is a piece of paper that allows you a slice, if you like, in the exploitation of workers. That's what a share is. If you're a share in a capitalist company, it gives you a share of the profits of workers under the name of a dividend. What's interesting about modern capitalism is you don't just get piece of paper, you speculate on these pieces of paper. So on the New York Stock Exchange, each day, 60 billion, work that out in terms of the poverty index I've just given you, is traded in shares. So 60 billion each day is bought and buying and selling shares. But the interesting thing is, these are not would-be capitalists who want their piece of paper to, if you like, claim their dividend afterwards, because the shares are only held on average for 1 year. So it's really about trading in shares rather than, if you like, claiming your pound of flesh. If you look at currencies, on the world level at the moment, 1.8 trillion is traded in global currencies. But only 15% of that is, if you like, to facilitate trade. The rest is buying and selling in currencies, trying to speculate. Futures. Futures began, if you like, to help farmers, if you like, make sure they have money to deal with harvest and so on. Now you can have futures in anything, in any currency, in any year. You can have an option to buy, a right to buy, and so on. 10 billion futures are traded each day. When we come to, for example, derivatives, we're talking about, for example, the one people may be more familiar with, collateralized debt obligations. Those were the, if you like, the stuff that was the toxic debt sent out from the bad housing markets of America right across the world. But just to put in figure in it, right? Between 2005 and 2007, $450 billion was spent on collateralized debt obligations. It is now thought that the defaults are worth $300 billion. Okay, that would feed approximately how many people? Maybe 300 million people would be fed by that loss on CDOs. Okay, so this is the problem, and that's just the knowns. If we look at the known unknowns, to quote Mr. Rumsfeld, there are, of course, over-the-counter trades. We know nothing about that. There is off-balance accounts from banks. There's shadow banking. We know nothing about that. We're talking about a vast casino economy in modern capitalism. Why? Why does it exist? This is really the key issue, because if you don't understand that, it's very difficult to think of solutions. Now, I want to really argue against two popular solutions that do the rounds. One is, let's call it, I think, the Bilderberg theory, that there is a group of people, maybe the Rockefellers, who often have Jewish names, who are involved in a conspiracy to play with money. Money is not really not a real entity. They simply write paper, and all of this happens by these strange, I forget that man David Icke thought of lizards and so on, that does this currency speculation. Now this is, by the way, you come across this theory quite a lot, that money is simply paper, and it's conspiracy to write more paper and fool the masses, and if we only be copped onto this, currency speculation would end. Well, the problem is, money is not just a piece of fantasy, unfortunately. It does come from the sweat and sometimes blood of human beings. It is the fruit of human labour. It's not unlimited what you can do in writing currency. If you do, you'll devalue the price of your goods, and so on. So it's not unlimited. Moreover, it doesn't explain why we would have such a shift into this enormous level of speculation at the moment. If we're run by the Bilderberg conspiracy, why weren't they pulling this trick off in the 1950s, the 1960s, rather than today? So I don't think that tends to explain much. The second explanation tends to be that, and is a classic explanation used on both the left and the right, that it's finance capital. This is finance capital that has caused all this, and that if you're a right-winger, you may link finance capital with Jews and so on, and you want a good, clean, healthy capitalist system. If you're a left-winger, you may argue we can have a progressive alliance with certain sections of the industrial bourgeoisie or whatever against finance capital. Now, whatever about the merit of those arguments in the past, they don't hold up today. You cannot argue there is a distinct sector called finance capital, which, if you like, has been closed off from industrial capital. Let's take, for example, I'm trying to go through this as quickly as I can, Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs is probably the most evil company in the world, with people like Peter Sutherland having all sorts of relationships to it and so on, who happen to be for the Lisbon Treaty and so on, right? But who is Goldman Sachs? Well, let's look at who Goldman Sachs is. The directors of Goldman Sachs are the following. The board of Goldman Sachs is composed of the director of General Motors, Mobil Oil, Novartis, Kraft Foods, Colgate Palmolive, DuPont, Texas Instruments, Boeing, and one other one. In other words, all production companies. So to say that finance capital bad, evil, nasty, but there's good capitalists, well, hang on a minute. The good capitalists are running the board of Goldman Sachs. If you take, for example, ExxonMobil, solid capitalist company involved in oil refinery, but ExxonMobil makes profits by buying its own shares. ExxonMobil, like an old failed pop singer, went out and spent 110 billion buying the shares of ExxonMobil in order to put the share price of ExxonMobil up. So they don't just do oil, they do rather shady games on speculation. And in fact, most capitalist companies do shady games on speculation. Therefore, it seems to me that you do have to get back to the point Colin was making, that the problem is not simply finance, or the Bilderberg conspiracy, or any other conspiracy you wish. It is actually capitalism itself. It's capitalism is the problem. This is what has led to this crisis, and therefore solutions have to take that into account. Why is capitalism a problem? Well, on one level, capitalism is a for-profit economy. Under the rules of capitalism, there's a separation of politics and economics. Capitalists do economics. They may do economics for profit. There's no criterion you can lay down to tell a capitalist that you must make profits from this rather than that. And therefore, that system in itself is an amoral system. I happen to agree with Ray on this. It's an amoral system. Then obviously, if you can make a 20% rate of return by speculating on your own shares rather than producing anything, why wouldn't you do speculation? So it's intrinsic in the system in that sense. But it's also intrinsic in that the global finance system, if you like, has risen out of capitalism, and crucially, at certain points, has been a solution for the problems of capitalism. If you can't understand why we have this enormous level of financial bubble without understanding the wider problems of capitalism itself. And let me just put it very simply. If you think of the 1990s, this is a point made by, for example, Robert Bremer. The 1990s is characterized by a set of bubbles. Capitalism needs bubbles continually to give it a revitalisation to keep it moving forward. You have the stock market bubble in the early 90s, you have the emerging markets bubble, huge investment in there, they destroyed half of Southeast Asia. You have the dot-com bubble, you have the telecommunications bubble, you have the property bubble, and then when that stopped, they were moving into the commodities index bubble, speculating on food, speculating on oil, and so on. So the issue therefore is, why does modern capitalism need these continual bubbles? What, in order to give it any energy or any dynamism? And here, and I'm obviously constrained for time, all I can do is urge you to read Das Kapital. It is the best book that has ever been produced. I'm not just saying that as a Marxist. It is unbelievable how if you like, the type of analysis it gives in terms of understanding the problem of capitalism, of overproduction, and crucially, the falling rate of profit, how the falling rate of profit, particularly in manufacturing, has created problems for the system. And what we have to understand is how the present level of global finance is a reflection of that. Let me just put it in simple terms. To put it in broad terms, capitalism in the 70s and the 80s, the story was about how do you, if you like, restore the rate of profit in manufacturing. And if you look at any country, you'll find a very simple graph, a graph between, if you like, the earnings of workers, which tend to flatline or grow slightly, and the productivity of workers. And they tend to diverge over a period of time. All countries, it's about, if you like, ensuring that workers are working harder while maintaining, if you like, the level of wages in order to restore that rate of profit. And they were partially successful. They were partially successful in America in particular. But they weren't successful enough. And therefore, even though the rate of profit was restored to some extent, partially restored in the 90s, it wasn't sufficient. And what happens then, really, is a solution which global capitalism stumbles on. A solution that was absolutely vital for its stability in the 90s in terms of what was known as the Goldilocks economy in the US. And what was that solution? It was a solution based on, first of all, the super exploitation of Chinese workers, an unbelievable exploitation of Chinese workers, $80 a month, the average wage of Chinese workers. Half the GDP of China is retained in savings. A good proportion of that GDP was invested in the foreign reserves of the US. Elements of solution number one. Elements of solution number two, with that, a practice developed of, if you like, providing cheap credit and encouraging working class debt. Working class debt was the great invention of capitalism in the 80s and 90s. Dramatic change from the 60s, where, if you like, working class people were encouraged to take out huge debts and compensate for the declining wages. If you like, the wage share of workers in most advanced industrial economies declined in the 80s and 90s, but capitalism overcame its problem of overproduction by, if you like, encouraging working class debt. And the third element was speculation. Let me just give you one figure. In the 1960s, 15% of the profits of the US came from finance, insurance, and real estate. By the 2007, that had increased to 41%. 41% of the profits of the US is built essentially on speculation. Enormous slicing off of capital into speculation. Okay, if that is the case, then let me then return to the question. What can governments do? Well, the question is, well, what governments? And what is their aim? Is their aim to prop up capitalism, or is it actually to destroy capitalism? And let me therefore take, more by way of debate, for example, the proposal on nationalisation. Again, it depends. The question, when you hear the word nationalisation, it seems to me, the next question to ask is, nationalisation for what purpose? To prop up capitalism, or to destroy and weaken it? If you propose, for example, nationalising the Allied Irish banks, which has occurred, what that has meant has been that the Irish people take responsibility for the debts of these economic criminals. That we have had to put in 3.8 billion. We've put in already 3.8 billion into Anglo-Irish Bank in order to, if you like, stop international bondholders calling in their credit guarantees. That type of nationalisation, and the nationalisation being advocated, I think, by the Labour Party, is very much a nationalisation that is directed at propping up capitalism temporarily while it gets over the hump and until we return to the supposed regular and regulated capitalism. The problem is that if you agree with any of the analysis I've made previously, capitalism, a regular and regulated capitalism, can only survive by increasing the level of exploitation of workers. It can only survive by massive state subsidies, through, if you like, all these bailouts. And increasingly, it will survive as great oligopolies that are linked to their state in a much more dangerous world that arise from the conflicts when oligopolies and state get together very well. So preserving capitalism is not necessarily a regular and regulated system, but rather a system that is constantly in crisis, even if we get out of this particular one. Okay, from that point of view, it seems to me the crucial question is not so much what can governments do, but to what extent can popular mobilisation intervene in this period to actually impose an agenda that's different to what the collective elite of modern capitalism want. And I think the next 100 days are going to be absolutely crucial in terms of what happens in Irish politics. I think obviously we need to vote no to the Lisbon Treaty, but we also need to see over 10,000 people on the streets of Dublin on the 19th on this anti-NAMA march, backed by the Unite Union, a number of the left political parties and so on. It's vital, not just that there's 10,000 people on the streets next Saturday, but the movement escalates. If you like, that it keeps going, it doesn't just go home and so on. These are vital for the future. In terms of what solutions we can impose, I think it's important to say the parameters must be the people must not take responsibility for the private debt run up by the banks. And therefore this is why I've advocated it's a good state bank. I have the misfortune that people like Richard Bruton is now using the bloody term, which is awful, but don't let that put you off. A good state bank means simply that we allow the existing capitalist companies to go insolvent, because that is the way you liquidate debt under capitalism. We do not take responsibility for that. That a state bank is set up to do what society needs. This is the apparent justification for NAMA. We have to preserve credit. We have to provide credit for society. Well, why don't we just cut out the middleman and provide credit for society by a good state bank that does that and does nothing else, that is banned from speculation, is banned from the type of for-profit activities that have characterised the Irish banking system. It seems to me such a state bank, if you like, linked to a strategy of, if you like, state-led industry, if like state industry, why use the word state-led? State industry, in order to, if you like, develop in strategic areas and to provide jobs to the population, is a far better solution than the type of solutions that arise from, if you like, trying to prop up capitalism. And the last point I want to make is this, that on a global level, there's all sorts of issues that popular mobilisation can achieve. The opening up of, if you like, offshore accounts, the scrutiny on the financial markets, the bringing into the public glare all the sort of misdeeds of modern capitalism and imposing popular measures on that. But it seems to me that, just to go back to the point I started with, it's important not to separate the issue of finance from the health of capitalism. And the way I put it very simply is, if the choice is being presented in Ireland between rescuing a number of private banks in order to provide credit for the population, why don't we have a good state bank, save ourselves the money, and use that money to create a massive public works scheme that is not simply driven by private industry, but is state-driven to provide jobs. These are the solutions that we need to the economic devastation that is affecting this country at the moment.
Thanks very much. A lot to think about there. I'll pass it on to John Foster.
Well, I'm not quite sure why you invited me. I think probably because I come from Scotland, and Scotland's probably got the most unenviable record in terms of financial misdeeds. The Royal Bank of Scotland and the Bank of Scotland put together their debts. I think the Irish debts would come to very little by comparison. I think it's something like 10 times the GDP of Scotland. I think your banks did quite well, actually. So I think that probably must be why you've invited me. Anyway, I'm very pleased to be here. I'm very pleased to be in Dublin at a time I can walk down some streets at any rate and see a lot of no posters up, because that gives us encouragement in Britain that if you do succeed in getting a no vote here, it will, of course, transform the situation internationally across Europe and elsewhere in terms of the battle against neoliberalism and for a different future. I want to, and what Kieran has said has very much helped anything I wanted to say. I don't agree with him on everything, but I think 90% I did, and it's helped no end. I want to say a few points really about what's happening in Britain and what can be done by governments. The first point I want to make is that governments are not inherently powerless in face of global capital. This was a long-standing myth promoted by the propagandists of the third way, people like Lord Gibbons. Governments can do nothing, capital moves around the world. And of course, immediately you get this financial crisis, international banks suddenly become national banks. Oh, yes, we need help from our government, the American government, or the Irish government, or the British government. So, governments do have power, but also some governments have more powers than others. And I think this is a very important point. The United States, Germany, and to a lesser extent Britain, have more power and can limit the freedom of others, i.e., for instance, Ireland. If you look at the moment at the European Central Bank and its effective micromanagement of a number of the European economies, that does represent the power of other groups of capital, particularly German, but also British, over these economies. It's what Desmond Greaves would have called, I think, imperialism. So that's the first point. Governments not inherently powerless, but some have got more power than others. Secondly, another obvious point, and Kieran's made it, governments are not neutral between capital and labour. Therefore, it is fruitless thinking that you can get some kind of technocratic fix to the crisis that will be of any benefit to working people. It will only be a solution that will be in the interests of working people to the extent that the existing governments are forced to move in a certain direction by the forces of organised labour. Come back to that. So, my main first area of discussion: what has the British government done since the onset of the financial crisis in two phases, that before the collapse of Lehman Brothers and that afterwards? Well, it's done a number of things, and it's done other things that have more or less entirely escaped observation. The thing to say to start with, of course, Britain, when I said Royal Bank of Scotland and the Halifax Bank of Scotland, I was being a little bit facetious. Of course, they're not really Scottish banks, they're British banks, and they're controlled and funded from the City of London. Britain is, of course, the biggest offshore tax avoidance centre, and the one that was used by the US banks to launch all their dodgy derivatives and other forms of speculation. And Britain itself, or rather Her Majesty the Queen, controls over half of all the tax havens in the world. They're under British jurisdiction. They're crown dependencies. So Britain is at the epicentre of the financial crisis. And it struck hard, although one doesn't want to over-egg the argument, because I think there has been perhaps almost a little bit too much of massaging up the figures by the experts in order to frighten us into accepting medicine. In fact, far more has been lost in terms of income for government through the recession than has been through the debts of the banks, I think. Somewhat more anyway. The actions of the British government so far is to recapitalise the debts of the banks, or the banks for the debts, to the tune of about 180 billion. That's something like 12% of Britain's, 13% of Britain's GDP. And also additionally guaranteed another 700 billion and put in a £20 billion stimulus into the economy. They've restored the flow of cheap money to the financial sector by lowering interest rates and by what's called quantitative easing to the tune of 175 billion. They have ensured by all this that the bad debts of the bank are passed on to the working people to labour. And these will be clawed back through cuts in the social wage and the public sector. And they've talked endlessly about regulation, but they've done absolutely nothing. As far as I know, not one piece of regulatory law has been passed by the British Parliament. All kinds of plans by Labour, by the Tories, by the Liberal Democrats, but nothing so far has been done. Apart from a big debate about bonuses, which is actually largely a red herring, I would say, in terms of what really needs to be done. But also they've done some very other interesting things that have been virtually entirely outside the public debate. It has secured, over the last 12 months, the biggest fall in real wages since 1977. The inflation report of the Bank of England is always worth reading because you get in the small print what is really happening. The inflation report for August 2008, this is before the collapse of Lehman Brothers, but at the beginning of the economic and banking crisis, talks about companies will need to pass on higher costs to households through some combination of lower nominal wage growth, higher prices, and lower employment, implying a reduction in purchasing power. That's August 2008. August 2009 report says they've done it. It says that there has been, as a result of a 2% inflation, a 1.8% reduction in real labour costs, real compensation per hour. So that's one thing that's been achieved over this period, which nobody really has brought out, certainly not the government. The biggest cut since 1977. An increase in the profit share from 17% to 18.5%, not all that big, but quite nice to have. And also, they put up a 20% tariff boundary around Britain. It's very nicely how they actually put this. The substantial depreciation of sterling should continue to encourage both domestic and overseas spenders to switch towards UK-produced goods. 20% tariff boundary around Britain. Very nicely put. They don't quite say that at the G20 conference, but they do in the inflation report of the Bank of England. Now, these actions, by and large, are the same across the capitalist world. I think Obama would like to do more in America, but Congress is not likely to allow him to do it. May, but is unlikely, I fear. So that takes us to the next point. What will be the collective consequences of current government actions? Everybody in Britain and all the papers are talking about the imminence of a recovery. A recovery is here. A recovery will take place in the next 2 or 3 months. OECD has revised all its figures. I think this is most unlikely. What there has been is a recovery in speculation. Government has provided cheap money, and the cheap money has gone into the stock exchange, into the luxury end of the residential property market, into commodities, and into takeovers and mergers into that area. But it has not gone into the productive economy. And the collective result of these types of action across Europe and the world will, I think, be a continuing stagnation, if not worse. And there's an extremely interesting article by Professor Robert Wade of LSE in the Cambridge Economic Journal, or Journal of Economics, for July. He says there will be a renewed recession and further bank crisis in 2010 for the following reasons. The failure of any government, bar China, to direct investment into the productive economy. Now that is definitely the case. In the second quarter of this year, there was an enormous increase in money to the banks through the quantitative easing in Britain. None of it went into productive industry. Bank lending to non-financial firms was down by 14 billion. Business investment in Britain as a whole was down 20% on the previous year. So it's not going into the productive economy. So they have not been able to do this, and they're not going to do it. Secondly, the cuts in the public sector will kick in 2010. European Central Bank report for July this year lays down the cuts that have got to be implemented by governments within the Eurozone. It's worth reading in detail. 0.5 of total GDP for those countries that are not heavily indebted, France, maybe Germany, although nobody really quite knows how badly off the German banks are, and 1% of GDP for heavily indebted countries like Ireland. Now, public expenditure is probably about 40% of GDP, so you have to multiply that up by 2, so it comes to 2.5% year on year, cumulatively, for 4 years. That's an enormous attack and cut into public expenditure. That is going to kick in Britain and elsewhere over 2010, plus rising unemployment and, as we've already seen, declining real income. And finally, there is the depreciation of the dollar and continuing currency imbalances that are likely to precipitate in the course of 2010 some form of currency crisis, he argues. Put all those things together and you do not have the basis of a recovery. Stagnation at the most, but quite likely renewed recession that will also trigger further banking crises. So, what should be done? Well, I think the first thing that needs to be done is explain what caused the crisis, and Kieran has taken most of the words out of my mouth in terms of what has actually caused it. It is not to do essentially with speculation, bonuses or bubbles. It's to do with the way in which the capitalist economy functions in our period. It's the way the very rich use the financial system to extract super profit. And here I might disagree a little bit, I think, on the definition of finance capital, because I think when Lenin used it and coined the phrase, along with Hilferding and others, they talked about, in fact, finance capital not being apart from industrial capital, but monopoly capital interlinking with banking capital to form the block, the very same phenomenon that you identified with Goldman Sachs. That's what they were talking about. And the ability of that block that controlled both the commanding heights of the productive economy and interpenetrated that with the banking system, thereby to be able to exact super profits at the expense of other sections of the capitalist class getting below average profit, but in doing so, precipitating crisis, precipitating forms of solution in terms of capital export and imperialism, and transforming the way in which the capitalist system operated. Now that has been unfolding in various forms over the course of the last 90 years, changing itself from generation to generation, but essentially that is the process. A gearing of profit that is to do with the link between, on the one hand, finance capital, which represents this great block of productive capital and investment banks, and in our last period of 30 or 40 years, retail savings, the savings of ordinary people, and a gearing, a leverage that is facilitated by the state. And that particular form of extraction of surplus value has two components in terms of what created it, what transformed it in the period of the 1970s and 80s, when, after a period of high unemployment and strong mobilization by the trade union movement through the 60s and 70s, as you said, profit rates had indeed gone down. And I don't need to rehearse this, everybody knows about the Friedmanite shock treatment and counterattack, and the use of unemployment to break the power of organised labour. And secondly, the process of financialisation. That is, taking a massive additional raft of workers' savings, savings for pensions, housing, health, and taking in a larger part of the public sector into a deregulated private sector, and using that to enhance financial control over productive industry, increasingly for short-term speculative purposes. It was the period when, of course, the European Union said public debt bad, private debt is good. And we've seen the results. In the period 2005 to 2007, private equity companies had a level of product profitability 3 times that of the average of the top 100 stock exchange companies. 3 times. Through a large period of the 1990s, hedge funds were running at a 15% profit. Massively above what the average rate of profit was. And if you think of, what was the name of that speculator? Magdoff? Yes, Madoff. Well, he was offering 15%. People thought nothing of it. That was the regular rate of profit. Why not give it to him? Well, and they lost it all. But this, this counterattack, this new system of gearing of profit, this financialization had contradictions. First, there was a fast accumulation of real and fictitious capital. And of course Marx, as you said, did foresee all that. Look at volume 3 of Capital, and he talks about fictitious capital, he talks about monopoly, the coming of monopoly, distorting the entire functioning of the capitalist system in a way that it can't control. Fast accumulation of real and fictitious capital, and therefore pressure on the overall rate of profit. Pressure on the resource base in the last 10 years, food, minerals, oil, and increasing international imbalances. And maintaining working class consumption built on debt in a period in which, as a result of the attack on labour, real wages, particularly in America, actually declined in absolute terms. Not all that amount for the medium, for the bottom section, absolutely declined. Building continuing consumption on the basis of debt, and of course debt is immensely profitable. It's much more profitable to lend to the very poor than it is to lend to the rich. If people default on their credit cards or default, you charge them a much higher rate of interest. And once securitized, then it becomes very valuable in the short term. But of course in the long term, it's toxic because people can't pay the debts. So those are the contradictions. What should be the demands of those on the left? Well, I would say the central one, the key one, is to break the link between retail savings, that's the savings of ordinary people, the great raft of savings for retirement, for housing, for health, to break the link between that mass of money, the retail savings in the retail banking system, and investment banking. That's what has to be broken. So you need a state bank for retail savings and pensions. And you need to reverse that process of financialization. You then need to attack investment capital itself. Subject tax havens in jurisdictions of Britain, America, Ireland, because of course you've got your own, to the full regulation of tax, strict controls on leverage, and a tax on transactions. These are quite reformist measures, really. You've got to then, in order to do that, break the neoliberal straitjacket of the European Union and the European Central Bank and the Growth and Stability Pact. I would say, because we're in a different situation in Britain, we've already done the job in terms of the bank debts, but in terms of what should have been done, the banks should have been allowed to negotiate terms with the bondholders. Maybe the government could have made provision of accommodation, possibly free medical aid for the discussions with the bondholders, but that's about it. Maybe lock the door and thrown away the key. But just to leave them to get on with it. I don't know the question, it's one I was going to ask here. Who are the major bondholders, the main external bondholders? Some, I think, are British banks. I think the RBS is one of the major ones. I think German banks, who are rumoured, or in fact have, something like 800 billion euros of toxic debts, are a number of the other major ones. And these are the people that Ireland is about to, unless it's stopped, mortgage its future to. So leave the existing banks to go. Invest state banking assets in productive industry, infrastructure, strategic development. And I think that can be elaborated also, and has been by Kieran. And address inequality through progressive tax systems, provision of affordable council housing, and strengthening the public sector, reversing the entire process of financialisation. These are the kinds of things that are in fact summed up in Britain in the People's Charter, which has now got, I think, the endorsement not quite of the majority of the trade union movement, but is moving in that direction. And I think it's pretty likely, as a result of the TUC taking place this coming week, to get the endorsement of the majority of the British trade union movement, because I understand that Unite has now put an amendment to the RMT resolution which would give support to the People's Charter. So you'd have the entire trade union movement united around the People's Charter. So that's a major move forward. Those are very much the demands there in the People's Charter. So I just want to come to an end now. Capital is obviously looking for its own solutions. They're obviously worried, the strategists of capital. I think there is a good chance that it could all just settle down, but I don't think it can settle down in the old way. You've got people like Adair Turner, who's head of the FSA, talking about the need for a transactions tax, talking about most of the activity, speculative activity in the bank in the City of London being socially useless. Now that shows strategic thinking, because that's what he represents, questioning a lot of what is happening. And this is because of the way it is impossible to see how the contradictions that have affected the capitalist system can be resolved. Because the scale of financialization is blocking the mechanisms for developing and investing in productive industry. Now, this might not be necessarily in other ages such a big problem, but in the period in which America and Britain and Germany are seeing their lead in productive industry being overtaken by China and other countries that were previously seen to be in the third world, this is going to accentuate global imbalances and currency imbalances strategically over the next 10 to 15 years. And somehow they've got to redirect money back into productive industry. How do they do it? And the other thing that worries them greatly is that they know the scale of the attacks that are going to have to take place on the great bulk of the population in order to stabilize and pay for the current banking crisis. I've outlined them. They are absolutely enormous. They're in the ECB July report. They're going to cripple the public sector. They're going to create long-term unemployment, and people in the places of power are gravely worried about the results. I think what happened in the Saarland elections will have caused the German ruling class to grit their teeth when, you could say, the old East German Communist Party manages to get 20% of the vote in Saarland. Then they obviously are feeling something's going badly wrong with their ability to control and manipulate that particular country, which is, of course, the heart of the EU. So problems of rule are there as well. Some solutions are being put forward, but it's difficult to see how they can be implemented in the new environment. Keynesianism revived, inflationary distribution. It would involve managed currencies. To that extent, it would be anti-globalization in a sense. But it's difficult to see how they could bring that about. And then there's Hyman Minsky, who's the other kind of prophet that's being put forward. where you would have a takeover, a public ownership of the retail banking system in order to sustain, by the state, profitable economic, productive investment in the real economy and stronger state regulation. But again, unless you address this nexus of control between those who control productive industry as it is and finance capital and the power that they exercise, it is difficult to see how the way in which they currently try and gear profits is going to be reversed. So there has to be a political solution, and unless you address that, then Minsky or none of these other profits that are being put forward are going to be much use. So just to conclude, what are the things that have to be done? First, we must explain the causes of the current crisis. It's not bubbles and speculation by themselves. It's this underlying process whereby super profits are extracted. And we must mobilize on the terms of organized labour and its basic interests. And that must be the way forward. There can be no other way forward that's going to reverse the balance of power and start to create the basis for a solution to this problem. Thanks.
Thanks very much, John. We move on straight away to Ray.
Does anybody want to take what is euphemistically called a comfort break? No?
No.
Okay. He's very good. No, I just said just a very small thing while I'm setting it here. There is a huge amount in the analysis. There's a huge amount in the analysis of Kieran and the previous speaker, which I agree with. But since at the very heart of my talk this afternoon is the common good, and at the heart of the common good is the human person, I have to say this, and Kieran, I hope you accept this in the spirit in which it's meant. There are recommendations of on board SNP with which I radically disagree, but I do know Willie Slattery to be a decent and honourable man. Mightn't agree with his views, not decent all of them, but I know Willie to be a decent and honourable man, and I don't mean that in any negative sense. So it's just important to put that on the agenda. Now, what I have to say is, as Colin said, it summarizes what I say in a book that's just published. It's published by Vonnier Press, as in V-O-N-I-E-R, Vonnier Press, and it's summarized in a recent article in the most recent issue of Studies, and just to give you a flavour of it, a new capitalism cannot be built on an old politics or on an ethical sense emasculated of Christian values. A political orthodoxy that not only failed to challenge but actively exploited a self-serving banking paradigm the better to consolidate its hold on power is incapable of building a new capitalism. What almost passes belief is that at this stage of the crisis there has been so little change in the nature of our political mindset and structures. The protection of Ireland's economic autonomy and democracy requires rethinking of such fundamental concepts as political legitimacy and leadership. And by that I meant something like this. I meant, you know, politicians are extraordinary people. God bless them, they work extremely hard, and I wouldn't want to be in their shoes. But why is it that, I'd like to get back here, why is it that a crisis that morphed from, whatever the causes, and I'll come to those, from a pathogen in the subprime crisis, it morphed from a small financial crisis into a wider economic crisis, into a global crisis? Why should they think, why should political establishments think that their way of thinking, their mindset, was not similarly to be challenged? Why should they think banking has to change, economics has to change, we have to have more regulation. But they couldn't see the plank in their own eye. Now, one has to be careful about judgmentalism, but I think the next stage in this crisis is the political catharsis, and that's coming down the line. Now, where am I here? Oh, yes. It always, see, I wasn't as well prepared as Kieran here. I didn't have copies of my overheads prepared. But anyway, funnily enough, yesterday when I was thinking very long and hard about this, and actually saying a few prayers about what would be the best way to do it, the one conclusion I reached to was, forget the damn PowerPoint. That's true. I said, forget it, we all arrive, we all arrive with PowerPoints, but I just thought, in the spirit of the Desmond Greaves Summer School, just get up there and tell it like it is. And I'm going to try and do that. First point I want to make is this: I really am glad to be here. It's interesting to be sharing a platform with a member of the Communist Party, but it really is, and a very distinguished member at that. The dialogue between Pope John Paul II and Habermas recognised the integrity of both positions. And one of my great heroes, Chiara Lubeck, a wonderful, wonderful woman. She sought unity above all. She didn't look for differences, even though there were differences. She sought the higher path of unity. So, first point I wanted to make is this. I didn't know a lot about Desmond Greaves before I was asked. I did know something about other people involved in this movement, Raymond Crotty and Anthony Coughlin. Anthony Coughlin sends me regularly updates on publications. They are just wonderful people. If Crotty hadn't had the courage to go to the Supreme Court, we wouldn't have had the privilege to vote on Lisbon today. What a wonderful. So you do need, these people like Raymond Crotty, God rest his soul, Anthony Coughlin, they do the hard thing. They risk being labelled as cranks for the integrity of their position. And ultimately, history usually bears them out to be to be prophets and not cranks. So I did want to say that. I don't know if Anthony's here, but in any event, I think they're just great people. Is he there? Oh, God bless you.
Thank you.
The second thing I'm going to say, if I had a nice PowerPoint, and you have to do a mind game here. You have to imagine a PowerPoint up here, all kinds of fancy stuff. The global financial crisis. Now, okay, it's gone through various stages. And it hasn't stopped. And recently, Alan Greenspan said, there will be another crisis. And while it's easy to be wise in hindsight, I remember arguing in the Irish Times and writing, in fact, in 2007, that we are on the precipice of a major seismic crash. And that was early 2007. I said the same thing in the European Parliament. So I'm not being wise after the event. The global financial crisis it's not just another crisis. There were pre-tremors. There were the kind of bubbles that Kieran talked about, but something I instinctively argued at the time that was something much more fundamental here. This was an ethical crisis, and it was a fault line between two ideologies, and I'd like to come back to that perhaps later, but I don't want to spend too much time on it. There are multiple causes, but at the end of the passageway, you come to the fact that this is a defining moment. Now, to answer the question, first of all, what have been the actions by European governments to support banks? Well, extensive liquidity support from the European Central Bank, zillions and zillions of liquidity poured into the system. As you said, quantitative easing in the UK. And then three main types of categories. Guarantees for bank liabilities, that means depositors. Recapitalizations by governments. and asset support schemes, one of which is engaged in this country. The figure that it comes to so far is estimated to be of the order of 4 trillion. Do a lot, 4 trillion, as Kieran pointed out. And the question I sort of pose to myself is this: what is likely to be the knock-on effects of this support for a failed paradigm, a demonstrably failed paradigm? What is likely to be the cost on the one hand, the ultimate cost, and the opportunity cost? Now let's do a little bit of exercise in terms of Ireland. The cost of recapitalising the 2 main banks. And by the way, it's important to say this: in the banks up and down the country, there are fine, ethical people. There are decent, honourable people. It's not the people doing the job that's the problem. It's the model itself that is malign. The people themselves, they are as much victims of it as the rest of the population who are impacted by the healthcare cuts. But the cost of recapitalising the Irish banks, 7 billion, just the 2 main banks. That's half the cost of running the HSE. And I did some research, was speaking at a conference, a medical conference, earlier this week. The kind of cuts that are coming down the line in the HSE are off the radar. And remember, this is the 3rd round of cuts that we'll see in the HSE. Last November, when the service plan was drawn up, it made it very explicit in the HSE service plan: look guys, we factored in value for money and all the usual crap, and we cannot cut any further without impacting on service levels. Fast forward to February, find another 80 million and a contingency of 270 million. Well, the board said we can't find it. Fast forward to, was it April? We've got to find another 800 million. So this, let's be very clear, the evidence is absolutely compelling. This is impacting on our health service and on the other services, like education, the kind of cuts. I went into my daughter's school there recently, and I said, what's the impact? Well, we have no transition year teachers. There's a short contract. And you can almost visibly see the edifice of education being corroded before your eyes. Now, what are the main objectives? I've given the kind of actions that have been taken by recapitalisation, nationalisation, liquidity support. What are the arguments for this? Safeguard financial stability. Well, I'm not quite sure about that, guys. We haven't reached financial stability yet, and if Greenspan is right, we're not about to do it. Restore the provision of credit and lending to the economy. Well, that's not happening. There is a ferocious squeeze on, certainly in the Irish economy, in terms of credit. The banks know that. I spoke at an IBAI conference there some time ago, and a couple of the lads came up afterwards and said, you're right. Now, it's not the individuals in the branch, but let's be clear, there is a very severe squeeze on credit in job-creating companies around the country, and in effect, enterprises are cannibalising each other because the credit's not there. In fairness and in terms of balance, you've got to argue, you have to recognise that it's a more risky environment, and maybe that's one factor behind why they're lending so much. On the other hand, you've got to say, well, you guys created this problem. The problems in Ireland are not essentially problems of subprime lending. They are self-inflicted and at so many levels. But that is happening at the moment. There is a severe squeeze on credit. Why? To rebuild the balance sheets and the profitability of institutions whose corporate mindset has caused this catastrophe. Now, this is a little thing I sometimes think that sort of gets across the impression of what's really going on here, the dynamic. One thing the crisis has taught us is this: the systemically important banks are public utilities. Let's be very clear. That's why governments argue we're putting in so much money. They are public utilities. Now, that's important. So, what is a bank and what does it do? Well, a bank can do nothing. If this gentleman here on the left who is writing assiduously, if he's a depositor, he puts his money in. Can't work without deposits. And if the lady beside him, she's a borrower, well, that's what generates productive activity, hopefully. And the gentleman in front of the camera is an employee. And without committed, ethical, professional employees, you ain't going nowhere. And on my right-hand side here, we have the public institutions, the taxpayers, who are supporting this, and who have supported it. Well, isn't there a little bit of an imbalance where all of the consequences of a failure in the banking system are socialised, and all of the returns, saving a little bit of tweaking here and there, accrue to the investors, to one set? Yes, you do need investors. You need depositors, you need borrowers, you need employees, you need a public, and you need investors. And in fact, arguably, the least important is the investor, because it's a hangover. Money, or the capital, is not scarce any longer. Capital is the least scarce factor of production. And yet, the whole system is predicated around short-term shareholder value. And that is the status quo ante to which we are defaulting. How bad is that? I mean, again, and a quoting from the ECB, what's the objective? To restore the long-term viability of the banking sector. And lastly, coming up on the outside rail, contain the impact on public finances and preserve taxpayers' interest. Well, maybe it was an accident it came last. But it's, it's pretty telling. Where did we come from? We've come from a very, very comfortable place, as we thought, but basically built in a bubble. The figures, when you look at them for Ireland, if you look at what's happening in the real economy, there's a real economy of jobs and worry and sweat and all the rest of it. The effect has been, I describe it as a whiplash from real growth of 5, 6, 7% per year. We, in 2008, nosedived, and in 2009, the economy will decline by probably 9%. I simply don't believe the talk about the green shoots of recovery, the evidence in respectable reports that look very carefully at the data is that next year and 2011 will be a very slow, if at all, progress back to some kind of climbing out of from the bottom of where we are. The one that's scary is the impact of this on the public finances. That's a scary one, because what happened, of course, is that government revenue imploded and government expenditure remained pretty high. Now, a few sums again. The deficit this year that we'll have to borrow will be of the order of 25 billion. I think it'll be more, but of the order of 25 billion. Now, if you assume the term of a government 5 years, if you assume that expenditure will be hard to control for all kinds of reasons, and political will isn't simply there, if you assume that expenditure will grow by 5% per year over the next 5 years, and revenue grows by 2%, and that's been very, very optimistic, in year 5 from now, we're going to be talking about an additional burden of debt, of the order of 150 billion. The interest alone on which would help keep our health service going. Even if you assume revenue is going to grow by 10%, and that's a very optimistic assumption, in fact it's just not going to happen, but you'd still be talking about a net addition to debt of about 120 billion. That's crippling. That is absolutely crippling for an economy which is dependent upon foreign investment, which has fallen in Europe, and for an economy that's been dependent upon government largesse, and we don't have it anymore to spend it, and inward investment. So the only wheel on the wagon really is domestic demand. And guess what's happening there? And as an economist that was groomed in the central bank and all the rest of it, I find it extraordinary how misconceived the government's budgetary strategy has been in the last 3 budgets. For an economy, like I said, the 3 wheels on the wagon of which are gone, the only wheel is domestic demand, and they are suffocating domestic demand. And week after week, more and more businesses are going, firms are going out of business, laying off people. It simply doesn't make sense. It seems to me it's almost as if it's fixated on trying to oppress the markets. Well, who are we kidding? I mean, the markets are people who work around us, work down the road in the IFSC, go home in the evening to their families. The markets are not stupid. Trying to impress people is not a smart idea. And trying to squeeze whatever life is left in the domestic economy by imposing a series of levies that simply bear no relationship to economic activity makes no sense to me at all. Okay, so where are we at? Just to broaden the canvas a little bit here, I think we're at a perilous position. For an economy that's dependent upon the external sector, there isn't anything happening. The big economies on which we're dependent for exports, such as the UK, which takes 20%, or Europe as a whole that takes about 40%, there's no growth in those economies, and they're fixated on trying to fix things themselves. So there will be no stimulus coming from the external sector. The government sector itself is, and by its own actions, hamstrung, so there is no room for the kind of fiscal stimulus that there might have been. There's very little fixed investment going on. All the fixed investment that was going on was building houses for people who weren't there, so there's no investment happening. So we are not in a good position. But that's only part of a wider crisis. There is a crisis in capitalism, in corporate capitalism, and where I would see it would be something like this. I think the family, which is the basic unit of society, the family has been emasculated. I think basic freedoms, and maybe, I'm surprised actually at one level that, maybe you'll have something to say on it later, Kieran, but I find it extraordinary that the basic freedoms that we should take for granted are being eroded in a very serious way. Freedoms to assemble, freedoms to speak, freedoms of speech. I mean, let's be very clear, and I'm not a political scientist, so I do defer to you, to where you guys are coming from. I think there has been, in the legislation, a progressive erosion of basic freedoms, and that needs to be part of any agenda looking at transformation. I think the land, you know, we are a country that is very rich in land, in natural resources. The land set aside, business suffocated, and the individual person that is at the heart of the paradigm I'm putting forward is marginalised. And here I agree with both of the previous speakers. I think in the system of capitalism that we've seen, in corporate capitalism, you know, the person, but here, the individual person has been absolutely marginalised, stripped of dignity, exploited. Now, you can actually go back to a really good book, Galbraith's The Affluent Society, and I'm sure many people here have read it. Okay, go back to the kind of thing that Galbraith was talking about. He drew a very prophetic distinction between needs and wants. Okay? Needs and wants. He said, we all have basic needs, society has basic needs, you can define them in different ways, but we would probably all in here agree on what basic needs are, give or take a little bit. And then there are wants. And he argues very trenchantly, prophetically, that the wants, this is in the 60s, were driven by marketing, by a concerted effort by banks to inculcate a culture of indebtedness. And this was no accident, that banks set out to encourage a cult of indebtedness. and also by good old original sin. Trying to, you've got a 4x4, I need a 4x4. You know, so it's a kind of reality check. What he was drawing was, I think, a very important distinction. How society could be manipulated and re-engineered, and our attention drawn away from our own basic needs, and every bit as important the basic needs of our neighbour and wants. I gotta get this. Now, I've seen it in my kids, and I've seen the transition in the kids and in their friends, the kind of, I gotta have society. You know, that's what's been happening. What do we need to fix this? Well, about 10 years ago, I mean, the book that Rebuilding Trust in Banking, I mean, one of the things at a global level I think we need, definitely, is a global financial regulator. The words financial regulator, I'll come to that later, because I'm not a great believer in regulation. I think we need, for example, in 2006, the EU published a green paper on hedge funds, which argued for light touch regulation, and I went into print and said, this is nonsense. Light touch regulation? So, you need certain regulation, yeah, but regulation won't solve the problem. Not in a catharsis like this. This is an ethical crisis. So, regulation is a necessary but not a sufficient condition. But we do need a global financial regulator. We need one with the resources and the mandate to address systemic instability and to ensure that the impact of this doesn't flow over, not just into developed countries, but every bit as important into developing countries, which are held hostage to the manipulation of markets in developed countries. We shouldn't be surprised at this. You know, when markets are a good thing, markets are a necessary social artifact, but when you have a financial market based on manipulation and engineering and opaque transactions and all the rest of it, and when that moves away from the constitutive purpose for which markets are there, you're in big trouble. And that's precisely what happened. This shadow economy, this enormous amorphous innovation, quote unquote, driven mothership just sheared off and actually subverted the functioning of the markets that were there and that do play an important role. So I do think we need a global financial regulator with a mandate and the resources to look at this in a very inclusive way. I mentioned Cara Lupek. I'm deliberately going to mention her again here for a moment because there are different paradigms in banking. There are different paradigms. There is no crisis in Islamic banking. And Islamic banking is not some little sideshow. Islamic banking is big. Well, why? Well, one of the fundamental tenets is that it's ethically driven. You don't lend for pornography, you don't lend for weapons. But if you do lend, it is risk sharing, it is participative. We need a little bit of humility to look to other models that are perfectly viable and that work, and where we have not seen these bubbles or crises. I mentioned Cara Lupek on the economy of communion, which has to do with micro-enterprises. She was a remarkable lady. She went to South America, and she said, like the crown of thorns outside Rio de Janeiro, you know, the places of the poor. She said, we have to do something about this. And so in Ireland, there is a functioning, flourishing economy of communion, where people say enterprise is about the human person. It's about society, it's about families. It's not just about short-term profit, and therefore enterprises should be allocating part of their profits, which I have no problem with because profits can help sustain investment, productive investment, but part of it goes into helping those in need, and part of it goes into supporting the model. There are models there. I mentioned the Islamic banking, which is highly practical. You can look equally to the Torah and the Talmud, and you will say if people had followed that, there would be no crisis. There would be no obscene bonuses. There would be no $15,000 waste paper bins in offices of people who perhaps didn't reflect enough on what life is about. Coming down the line, we have the banks which will need more recapitalisation. We have NAMA, we have in 2010 the decision coming up, Colin, what are we going to do about the present credit deposit scheme? Are we going to renew it? What will happen if we don't? How does NAMA and the credit guarantee scheme knit in? And here, I want to make one point with crystal clarity, if I may. Some very intelligent, bright, decent people say, well, you know, we should support the banks, they're systemically important and all the rest of it. Well, I can buy that argument. What I can't buy is that you would support the recapitalisation of banks at such an enormous cost in health and education and welfare, and not say to them, change the effing model. Change the model. Recognise the inclusivity that there is in systemically important institutions, in utilities. Change the model. Okay, we'll support you, but change the model. Make sure that the borrower or the depositor or the public person or the employee, that they are esteemed and respected equally with the investor in making banks happen. Okay, what would I do? Coming to the end, what would I do? Just a couple of things. In terms of Ireland, I would maintain domestic demand. The last 3 budgets were simply wrong. They were misconceived. I would prioritise families and employment and businesses over supporting a failed banking model. And if it was supported, I would say, these are the conditions, guys. And by the way, it's in the legislation. The model changes. It's not just about investors, still less about short-term profits, and it's certainly not about rebuilding the status quo ante. It's about building a narrow bank, building a societal bank, call it what you will, it's a different kind of animal. I would scale back the size and scope of government intervention. Now, in the last, up to 2008, the Irish population grew by a very robust 10%. A lot of babies, and isn't that great? Great. The size of government grew by 30%. You know, it is, I mean, it's just unreal that government hasn't looked at itself. Now, I have to say this fairly sensitively, because it's easy standing on, or sitting on a platform here to say, you know, jobs have to go. Well, if jobs go, you have to go home in the evening and say to your family, I've been let off. Now, I may say here, sitting up here, well, you have to come back in the size of government, but I've got to be conscious of the effect of that on your family. So there has to be and I use the word sensitively, a sensitive scaling back of the size of government, which is too big, too interventionist, too suffocating of freedoms, and has lost the run of itself. What else would I do? I would empower the voluntary sector. Now, the voluntary sector, what do we mean by that? Well, who are the people on who we rely really for keeping the country going? Very few of us, communists or Christian, whatever you're having yourself. The St. Vincent de Paul Society does a very good job, and have been doing it for 40 years. They know what's happening before the CSO. Cúnmhuire, and one of my heroes from whom I've learned a very great, Sister Concilio Fitzgerald, who 40 years ago started rehabilitation for people suffering from addiction, and is now the biggest provider of residential rehabilitation in the country, recently accredited. She does a magnificent job, and it's focused on the person. You know, we really do not need the state looking over the shoulder of the St. Vincent de Paul, or the GAA, or Cúnmhuire, or whoever, and telling them how to go about their business. You know, it just doesn't make sense to me. I think there are 2 more points that I would do. One of them is, I think we need a New Deal, and I deliberately bring that phrase evocative of American history. We need a New Deal to underpin a more relevant form of social partnership, which is focused on needs and not wants. I think social partnership, very important, and all the rest of it, but I think what's needed now, more than anything, we have to both grow our way out of this economy, and we have to transform the economy. And we have to transform the economy not just as an economy, but as a as a society. And that is possible. The people are there, people like Ken Whittaker, who was my boss when I was a Carlow economist. And the models are there. I don't know if any of you have looked at spiritofIreland.org. You checked it out? Graham O'Donnell, anybody checked it out? Well, you will know. I mean, here's a guy, I'm not doing a PR job for him, but it seems to me it makes an awful lot of sense. Because what his model is based on is renewable energy. And it's evidence-based. And there's an awful lot of research behind it. And what he says is very interesting. He says, guess what, guys? Ireland is uniquely gifted with renewable energy at two levels. Wind power, well, we didn't need to be told that, but it's interesting. And the other is hydro. The sides, we have Arden and Crusher, where you had to cut the top of a mountain. But on the left, on the coast of Ireland, you've got lochs that can be dammed. And his estimates are that within 5 years, Ireland could be self-sufficient in energy. Within 10 years, we could be exporting energy. Now, it's not just the new generation of jobs. It's not just the renewable energy. Is this feasible? Well, yes, it is. If you check with Fine Gael on their manifesto, it's number 3 on the manifesto. He has met Brian Lennon. He has met all of the departments, and all of them are saying is, when in the name of God are you going to do this? But watch this space. So, it is possible to have what I call a New Deal based on a different paradigm for banking and based on a political transformation. Politicians, very good, decent people that they are, but the political model cannot assume that it is immune from what has happened in economics and finance. That's what we need, I think, to do. Now, I've just got 2 or 3 points left that I want to conclude on. I think what we're watching at the moment, almost in slow motion, is the very slow death of corporate capitalism. But we're also watching our inability to engage and learn from other societies. I think we're looking at the fallibility of government, and we're forgetting what the theory of public choice says about how political systems work. I think we're looking at an ethical void in our political discourse, and I think we're ignoring the absolute centrality of the common good, the public good, which is a pedigree of 1,000 years, and at the heart of which is the unique dignity of the human person. I think we're looking, hopefully, at a move away from the tyranny of wants and the denial of the needs that are there in our society. And what I hope we're not looking into is a societal betrayal in advocating a return to the status quo ante. Now, my colleagues and friends here, as I said, the family, the individual, our basic freedoms, our natural resources, there's a lot of ammunition there. But my colleagues here quoted, and he was a good economist, Marx. I'm going to quote from Christ. Because if there is one thing we do need, it's a new form of leadership. It's a new form of leadership. And I call this a leadership of service to the person. If there's a biography of Mao published a couple of years ago. Communism has made mistakes. Communism has made very big mistakes, just as capitalism has. But what both of them, what a failed capitalist model and an obsolete, perhaps, communist model should have in common is respect for the person and a concept of leadership. Now, here's what I want to say to you guys. I want you to listen. Now, before the feast of the Passover, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, rose from supper, laid aside his garments, and girded himself with a towel. Then he poured water into a basin, and he began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. He came to Simon and Simon said to him, Lord, do you wash my feet? And Jesus answered him, what I am doing you do not know now, but afterwards you will understand. Peter said to him, you shall never wash my feet. And Jesus said, if I do not wash you, you have no part of me. When he had washed their feet and had taken his garments and resumed his place at table, he said to them, do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example, that you should also do as I have done to you. Now, I just want to let that, because that contains its own kind of message. We have had power. One of the most riveting books I've read recently is a study by Professor Emeritus in Harvard. It's on one of my set texts. It's called Enron, the corruption of innovation, published in 2008. There weren't all evil people. There were people who were corrupted by the model. And their concept of leadership, God help us, was a title over the door, and was a new car a day once a year, and was money. And unfortunately we've seen it in politics as well, the obsession with power. And we've seen in the Middle East and elsewhere where that leads to. It's a scary place. We see it now in each and every one of us. I've seen the opposite. I've seen the opposite. I've seen the opposite in Ken Whitaker, who, although he reshaped Irish history, when he was finished in the central bank, he went back to UCD and sat in the lecture halls as an undergraduate doing a degree in Celtic studies. And I've seen it in Sister Concilia Fitzgerald, who, if you find her in one of the houses, she'll either be attendant to somebody who has been addicted and admitted for the 14th time, or cleaning out the toilets. We need, more than anything, a new leadership. All the other things we've talked about here, you know, the death of corporate capitalism, and all of the failings will mean nothing if we don't have, it seems to me, that new type of leadership. So, on that note, thanks for your patience.